Dear friends, what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you go through the cycle of all the usual ones that everybody wants to be at some point? I know I did. I don't sure I ever wanted to be a priest, so I'm sure there are stories that I've forgotten now that would remind me even of that. I wonder, though, whether you ever did what Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux and her brother did as far as deciding what they wanted to be when they grew up. When they were 7 and 5 years old, they decided they would leave their house in France, mind you, to go to Morocco so they could be martyrs with the Franciscan missionaries. Needless to say, they didn't make it far past their house when they were brought back, and it took a lot longer for Sainte Thérèse to end up in the sort of life that she had. But at least they were beginning to think a little bit about what it is that a saint is and what it is that a saint does. Clearly, I don't think anybody sets out to be a saint. I'm not sure anybody should set out to be a saint. There are some things that we need to have the action of God to produce, and if we try to do them ourselves, we're probably not going to succeed. There used to be a saying in the church that anybody who wants to be a bishop shouldn't be. That works in some cases and doesn't work in others, but I'll leave that to your judgment as far as individual clergy people. Nonetheless, you and I are the raw material of saints. If nobody sets out to be a saint, then there's nothing to say that you or I might not end up as one. As it says in a hymn that we're not singing today, and there's no reason, no, not the least, why I shouldn't be one too. So it's probably worth spending a little time thinking about what the lessons are that the saints teach us about what it means to live the faithful life. Whether we end up as saints or not, it really doesn't matter. You and I are called to live as faithful people, to live our lives in a way that builds the kingdom of God as best we can. And there is much to be learned from the lives of the saints in trying to figure that out. So I have a few lives of saints to tell you about today and see where that gets us in thinking about what perhaps we also ought to be doing in our own lives. The first one I'm thinking of is St. Catherine of Siena, who, unusually for a woman in her time, which was the 14th century, was deeply involved in politics and was sent on embassy missions and wrote to all sorts of powerful people, powerful men, and had a deeply spiritual life as well. When she died, in fact, she was not in Siena, she was in Rome on one of her diplomatic missions. But she already had such a reputation at the time for saintliness that the Romans decided they would bury her there so they could continue to venerate her legacy. Now, the people of Siena were not pleased with this. They thought she was from there and they should have her back. They knew they weren't going to get all of her, so they figured they'd go and get a little souvenir of some sort they could hold on to. So they sent a few Sienese people to Rome, and because they wanted to be low-key and casual about it, all they did was cut the head off her dead body in order to take it back to Siena with them. Apparently, this was not entirely out of the realm of possibility. The Roman authorities kind of suspected they might try it, I guess, because they had people standing at all the gates of the city, checking to make sure no one had the head of St. Catherine of Siena as they left the city. When this particular group of people got there and opened the bag, the head had been transformed miraculously into a pile of rose petals. But, in fact, that was only temporary, because if you go to Siena today, there is the head of St. Catherine above one of the altars in one of the churches where you can see it on full display all the time. I'll leave it to you whether that is a deeply devotional thing to see, somebody's mummified head over the altar. But nonetheless, I think it does teach us that if you're going to be a saint or even just do the work of God, you better keep your head about you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be appearing here all week. It's a good message. There's very little about mission of God, the will of God in the world, that is linear or simple or predictable. How many of us have ended up someplace we never expected to be, doing something we never expected to do, because somehow the church and our devotion and the will of God in our lives has led us there. I know I have gone to all sorts of places I never expected to go. I can remember going to a neighborhood in Washington that you didn't go to at night with the rector of a very wealthy church with a pickup truck full of furniture we had to drop off. I have no idea how I got talked into it, let alone how he got talked into it. wasn't his truck or his furniture, and yet there we were. There's a great deal of creativity and imagination, flexibility, and willingness to think that things might be possible that we wouldn't even imagine are possible if we are going to be faithful followers of Jesus. I can remember at my last church, it was in a country town up in Pennsylvania, so we had good farmers markets. All around us was farmland. Everybody had a garden. It was constantly enormous supply of food in season, all kinds of things you wouldn't expect to get, much fresher than you'd ever get from the grocery store. It was a lovely opportunity, and yet we observed that those who needed that food the most, those who had SNAP benefits they could be spending at the farmer's market, didn't do it. And with a little investigation, we discovered that if you've spent most of your life shopping in convenience stores and dollar stores and in the inside lanes of the grocery store where you buy things that all you do is take them home and heat them up and they're ready to eat, you wouldn't necessarily know what to do with a kabocha squash, even if it's cheap and fresh and right there in front of you, and even if the person selling it is willing to make a deal to sell it to you cheaper. That was a problem. But then we noticed that the university, as universities are sometimes inclined to do, had bought some prime downtown real estate, torn down the buildings that were there, and built a very large, very ostentatious, and somewhat controversial building on Main Street in Bloomsburg. Turned out they had also put in a very elaborate teaching kitchen on the second floor of this building. I mean, complete with TV cameras. You could have done cooking shows from this place that they very rarely used because they had built it only because they had the money and needed to do something with it. From there, it was a pretty simple lineup, wasn't it? People who need food, supply of food, a place where you can learn to do something with the food, an agency that might possibly be able to talk people into going from one place to the other. All we had to do was be the matchmaker. And so we did. We got all these people in our parish hall, and we talked it all through and created a cooking program. People could come learn how to prepare the food that they could easily be picking up at the farmer's market, take home the food, take home the utensils, take home the new confidence they would have in cooking in a way that perhaps would never have occurred to them before. We, the church, had no resources to do any of these pieces on our own. We didn't have a farmer's market. We didn't have a demonstration kitchen. Other people did, and with a little godly arm twisting, it was easy enough to get everybody lined up. We kept our heads about us, saw the need, saw the possibilities, and put them all together. Creativity, dear friends, it is an important quality of the Christian life. Second person I'm thinking of is a little stranger, St. Simeon the Stylite. He lived much, much earlier in the church, at a time when the wildness had not quite gone out of the church yet. And there were people who were still looking around saying, this is just way too tame going to church on Sunday with all these city people. I can't do this anymore. And St. Simeon, apparently having a full dose of the creativity I just mentioned in the first part, decided that what he would do was go live on top of a pillar. Stylite isn't a group from the 60s. It's a term for someone who decides to live in a tiny little crow's nest on top of a pillar someplace. That way he could certainly get away from all these people who bugged him, who in his opinion were not living an adequately rigorous religious life. What he didn't realize was it made him pretty charismatic. People started coming to him asking for advice. Then more people came asking him for advice until he couldn't get any peace on top of his pillar. In the end, they had to set up a perimeter around the pillar. You couldn't come within 50 feet of it, apparently. Although, as I said to the 8 o'clock congregation, if you're living on top of a pillar with what might be described as limited sanitary facilities, I'm not sure you want to get any closer than 50 feet to that place. In any event, we really should expect that whatever it is we do, if it is truly inspired by God, will draw a crowd. Certainly that's what happened with Jesus. He has been talking to small groups and then larger groups and then larger groups and then even larger groups. Now he's being followed by an enormous number of people. The problem is, I think we have to be honest that although some of those people were there out of honest devotion to what Jesus was saying, love for him and for his message, and although there were some people who were there hoping to receive what they needed from God, there probably were people in that crowd also who were just hoping he was going to say something they could use against him, just waiting for him to slip up. And there were probably people in that crowd who were there trying to prey on the other people because they assumed they were easy pickings. It will not always be the case that we attract the kind of crowd that we want. It will not always be the case that we draw a crowd, all of whom agree with what we're trying to accomplish, or who are even willing to allow us to try to accomplish it in peace. About a month ago, I went to a meeting of clergy with the Delaware Food Bank. And different clergy from different churches around the area were talking about what their experiences have been, particularly in the last several months, as things have become more difficult on a variety of fronts with trying to feed people. And the pastor of one church in Wilmington was talking about how it is they handle their feeding. In order to be as available as possible to everyone, they have their feeding ministry outside. They have some overhang or sheltered area outside their church hall, I guess, and so they put out refrigerators and other containing sorts of things so that whenever you need it, you can come and get it, even if it's out of office hours, on the weekend, middle of the night, whenever it might be. And that worked really well until they discovered that in the last few months, we've all had to learn that church parking lots are technically public space. They are not private. And so any law enforcement agency can come onto your parking lot whenever they feel like it without any permission and without any warrant. It turned out that at least a few agencies involved with immigration and other sorts of things had discovered that this was a place where people were going to get food that is in public. Easy enough to stop by there once in a while and see who it was who was coming by. So the church had very quickly to come up with a plan where at least when they were open for business, they could get everybody inside the building quickly, which does count as private space, and then rules regarding warrants and so forth would apply. You can't always expect that everyone who notices what we were doing is going to approve of it or is not going to see it as somehow convenient for a purpose that we never intended. And yet that shouldn't stop us. We have to continue anyway. The third saint that I'm thinking of is St. Ambrose. He lived in, again, the early church, in the 4th century, I think. He was the secular governor of the area around Milan, what is now Milan in Italy. He had accepted the Christian faith but had not yet been baptized, as was not uncommon in that era. But it turned out that in that time, whenever they had an election for a church leader, particularly for a bishop, fights tended to break out because there were different factions that had different attitudes on theology and so forth. And so, presuming there might be such a fight on this occasion, Ambrose, the governor, went along to the election, where to his horror, they elected him. He was so distressed by this that he fled and hid, but the person who was hiding him eventually gave him up because he was inspired by God to do so. They brought him back. He ran away again. They brought him back a second time. And finally, the Pope had to write to him and said, look, you just got to do this. I mean, come on, work with me here. And so in the space of a week, he was baptized, ordained as a deacon, a priest, and a bishop, and served for the rest of his life as the Bishop of Milan with great distinction, particularly as one who was pastoral in helping his flock deal with the uproars of theology and disputes in his time. There's something to be said about the way the call keeps following us. No matter how big it may be, no matter how complicated it may be, perhaps especially when we don't quite know how we would do it because we've never done it before, we can't even imagine doing it. The call is still there, never goes away, never really goes out of our heads. And sooner or later, we just have to turn around and figure out a way to deal with it. Certainly in my own ministry, it has been the case again and again and again when someone calls me for what ought to be a simple transaction. I need help with my electric bill. I need to have my auto insurance paid. I need help with my rent, whatever it is. That's never the whole story. And in the course of a conversation, tell me what's going on, how is your life? I hear about unemployment, disability, spouse's illness, person's illness, children in trouble, parents who are sick, housing instability, everything else that goes on in people's lives, and I begin to realize just how big the problem really is. This happens again and again and again. We're confronted by how big the problem is we're trying to fix, and how often all we have been given, it would appear, is Band-Aids. And yet, dear friends, somehow it is the Band-Aids we're called to keep sticking on. One way or another, God will deal with the need. We can't ignore it. We certainly can't choose not to use even the limited resources that we have been given in trying to respond. Certainly, when we hear Jesus talking about blessed are the poor, or blessed are the hungry, or blessed are those who mourn, these are huge categories of people. There's very little we can do that will say, okay, we can check off we're taking care of the poor, next we're going to move on to the hungry. And yet, with what little we have, we must act. The next person I'm thinking of is a saint called Macrina. She also lived early on in the 7th century, I think. She was the daughter of a wealthy family, but who from a very young age had a deep spiritual life. So at a certain age, she told her mother that she would never marry and would never leave her mother. So the two of them went to one of their country houses and started a convent there, a religious house, which attracted more and more people. In the process, Macrina began to influence her brothers, two of whom, Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great, ended up as two of the 3 Cappadocian fathers, who were major writers of theology in the church. They brought along one of their buddies, St. Gregory of Nazianzus. One of her younger brothers became a bishop. One of her other brothers entered the religious life. They produced an enormous family of people, and extended family, who were deeply influential in the church. In this, I think we're being told something about the way that blessings multiply. Clearly, it is never the case that sainthood is a solo act. One of the beauties of All Saints' Day, as compared to all the other saints' days that we observe through the year, is that today we recognize just how many of them there are. It would be awfully easy to imagine St. Francis or whomever just kind of wandering around the landscape doing whatever without anybody else being there to help. And yet that was never, ever the case. There were always other people involved. There will always be other boats with us, as it says in one story about Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee. How often in our own vestry discussions, when an idea for a ministry comes up, is our first response to say, well, somebody else is already doing that. Why are we going to do that? They must be doing it better than we are. They have more money than we do. When is that ever the right answer, dear friends? That, of course, is a rhetorical question. The answer is never. We are always working with others. And somehow in doing that, the blessings are always multiplied. Once again, however small the place we begin may be, we have to know that God is sending other resources, sending other souls to walk alongside us, to work alongside us, to bless alongside us. And then the last of my saints for the day is Blessed Gerard. He lived in the very early church, again in the 4th century. No, I beg your pardon, in the 11th century. He was a Benedictine in the Holy Land who was given the job of starting a hospital in Jerusalem to care for those who came as pilgrims, usually from far away, to worship at the holy sites. A job for which he didn't have any particular qualifications, but which he seems to have done very well. We know very little more about him than that. We don't know much about the hospital. It's long since gone. But somehow that work that he started there has echoed down the centuries in the form of work that other bits of the Knights Hospitaller, which was the order that he started, has continued to do. Only last weekend I was at the Order of St. John's annual event in Washington. That's one of the echoes down the centuries of the Hospitallers, the order that Blessed Gerard began. No one would have thought that 2,000 years, well, 1,000 years later, the various St. John branches would be running ambulance services and hospitals and first aid services and all kinds of things that you would never have imagined. I'm sure Blessed Gerard would never have imagined that in Jerusalem and in the West Bank and in Gaza even, to this day, his descendants, his spiritual descendants, are still providing medical care. The group that I belong to in the United States sends support to eye hospitals in Gaza and the West Bank. I was pleased last weekend to hear that even though in Gaza the facilities that have been built are now rubble, the people that we support are still doing the work. I can't even imagine how they're doing it. Somehow, however, our work echoes. What can we imagine starting now that somehow is going to echo into the future? Can we even imagine? I'm sure Gerard didn't. Luckily for us, all we have to do is worry about what we're doing right now. Do the work of God in this place, whatever has been put in front of us. Whether that makes us into saints or faithful people or fools for God, it makes no difference. Somehow God will bless it, and we can only pray will bless us in the process. Amen.